Hello and welcome back to Poker Fundamentals. This is chapter 4. Last time we looked at ace and king high boards, whether we can see about a whole range of 25%, and the EV regress was always less than 3%, so we decided that's at least a reasonable idea. So now I'm going to move on to queen jack 10 high boards and then less than 10 high boards and see if there's any boards where this strategy doesn't work. So I've got loads and loads of flops up here. I'm just going to show you some of the stuff I've already been looking at. I already ran through basically the boards where we should check the most or have the most different sizes. This is queen jack 10. Looking at the difference in EV here, we can see 4.9 goes to 4.83. 1064, this is a board where the original strategy has a lot of overbetting, and this is something that I want to kind of put to the side, that essentially it's the boards that we have the most overbets that are going to be the ones worth composing a different strategy. If it's a board where we never have any pot size bets or more, it's almost certainly going to be fine to do the range bet small. But if it's a board where if we AI solve and the solver's going to choose 100% pot or 133% pot as the one size strategy, it could be enough of an EV difference that it's worth having that. Do we check or do we bet pot, or do we check or do we overbet on the board instead? So 10-6 board is one where we might consider this. You see the EV here is 4.3 for the normal strategy, and then here I've forced it to range bet 25% and it's gone down to 4.25. So the EV regress on this exact board is not very significant, but we might be able to bucket this board with a few others when we are deciding which boards that we want to compose a different strategy. But for now, queen high, jack high, 10 high, all fine. I've also pulled a monotone board here, which is the one that had the most checks, queen 8-7 flush draw, and we can see the original strategy here, quite a lot of checks, better 20%, better 33%, even a bit of half pot. And we have 3.83 EV for this strategy, whereas the range bet has 3.81. So again, just range bet 25% for sure here. The last board I want to look at for the middling boards, 10-9-7 flush draw, 3.94 compared to 3.91. I did look at as many of these boards as possible. Queen jack 10 high boards of any variety, range bet 25% definitely still works fine. And before we move on to the low boards, I wanted to have a quick look at paired boards because I think they're relatively simple. This first one is 552, and you might be surprised to see 3.62 becomes 3.61 with the range bet 25%. Next, we're going to look at ace ace king. So it might be surprising that this is a board where we check 25% of the time. 4.63 EV goes to 4.62, inconsequential. Next, I want to look at the 766, and I'm comparing to an AI solve here because basically the EV of the strategy takes into account the big blind and how they play their strategy. And if the solver does a normal strategy, the big blind might have some leads. But if we always lead 100% of our range 25% pot, it doesn't make sense for the big blind to have leads because we're always going to bet anyway. So all the hands that might be good leads could now just check raise or check call or do something else because we're doing the betting for them. The only time it makes sense for someone to lead is if the other player is not range betting. In this case, I'm comparing the EV forcing the big blind to check. And this is the usual solver strategy. We check 60% of the time, which is a lot of check, 3.46. And then when I forced the solver to bet with range, that goes to 3.37. Still not significant enough, but it is worth thinking about this leading aspects. Maybe it's the type of boards that the big blind likes to lead, are the type of boards that we might want to have a check range. Rather surprisingly, even the 60% checking range going to a range bet here is a very small difference. Next, king 9-9 flush draw. Solver strategy bets quite a lot. 4.16 goes to 4.11. Lastly, I want to look at the most extreme paired board that I could find. This is a 7-7 flush draw. And look at this checking range, 78.7% checks. That's only because I've forced the big blind to check. The big blind wanted to have 100% pot leading range here, which I don't think anyone is doing. But when the big blind checks with range, because their range is now bolstered by the fact they're not leading with a lot of 7x and some other random stuff, we actually can't bet very often in theory because we're just going to be run over from all the trash we've got, I imagine, in this offsuit Broadway region, or just in these like any two suited cards that aren't hearts or diamonds, just can't really do anything. So we're supposed to check a lot, but let's compare the difference anyway. 3.83 goes to 3.74. Still not significant enough for us to say let's do something different, but it is still worth thinking about. Why is this the type of board we might not want to bet with our whole range? Why is it the type of board the big blind might want to lead? One of the main reasons is this offsuit 7x region from the big blind. The big blind has king 7 offsuit pure, queen 7 nearly pure, a lot of jack 7, a lot of 10-7, 9-7 offsuit pure, 8-7 offsuit pure. We don't have any of these offsuit 7x. You can see ace 8 is our kind of the cutoff point for our offsuit hands. That's the most significant example. Paired boards still range bet 25%. You're going to be fine. All of these factors, it's fine. Range bet 25%. But now we're going to look at less than 10 high boards. Disconnected actually doesn't exist, so I'm going to get rid of that. This is 862 rainbow. It's semi-connected, it's low. You can see there's a lot of overbets going on here, which is a signal to us that the solver's one-size strategy is going to be probably at least 70% pot, maybe full pot, maybe an overbet. EV of the original strategy, 3.83, forcing it to bet 25% pot. That goes down to 3.7, which is around about 3.4% EV loss. We are getting into the region of maybe we should do something different now. I'll give you a window into what the solver does. For one, the solver leads a lot as the big blind here for 40% pot. because it's using a one-side strategy, and it knows because the hijack is going to overbet or check. The hijack's going to check a lot, meaning whenever your opponent checks a lot, that might make sense to have a leading range here. 40% is actually quite a big leading size, and the hijack likes to bet 133% pot, a massive overbet, usually around immediate overpairs, most top pairs, and then a lot of bluffs, checking with this region, which is just two overs showdown, ace highs and king highs. We'll come back to this overbet strategy, but for now, range bet 25% is fine. And you can see same again on the 752. EV 3.75 compared to range bet 25%, 3.66. It's still not enough for us to say, let's make sure we do the strategy right now, because otherwise the strategy, the EV loss is too big. I'm going to put it in the pile of we should overbet this board instead, and let's group them all at the end. Finally, 964, original strategy EV 4.06 goes to 3.98. So I'm going to say low semi-connected. The same still applies. And the final category of board, the one we've been dreading, low connected. Let's see how many boards that is first. We've got any low connected board, that is 8.1% of boards, which is anything 9 high or lower, where straight is already possible. 48.4% checks. That's about 3 times as much checking on these type of boards. Still betting at least half the time on average though. Monotone looks like the boards that we're still happy with the small range bet the most. Take the most extreme monotone, which is 8, 7, 6. And let's just make sure monotone is going to be fine with this small range bet. Original EV 3.46. New EV 3.37. The most extreme monotone board, the super connected, low, the EV regress is not significant. So I'm going to filter out monotone and say that monotone is fine to still range bet 25%. So we're left with these last two categories, rainbow and flush draw, low connected boards. This is 652 rainbow, and like I said before, if we force the hijack to bet with its full range 25% pot, the big blind won't have a lead range, because it doesn't make sense when you know your opponent's going to bet every hand they've got. In theory, the big blind has quite a lot of leads, 16.1%. I'm going to compare to the original solve strategy. First, let's look at the EV with leads. Once the big blind checks, we have 3.63. And if I force the big blind to check, it goes way down to 3.46 already, just because the big blind's range is so much stronger when it doesn't get diluted from the leads. It makes more sense to compare to this because we're comparing against the big blind range that's not leading, just to make it more uniform. So in this case, big blind's checking everything. In this case, big blind's checking everything. The EV here, 3.46, and the EV here, 3.28, which does go over that 5% threshold, even when we try and make it as similar as possible. So 652 is a board we don't want to range bet 100%. Let's look at a few other boards to see if is it every low connected board that's doing this? This is 874 flush draw, 3.53 becomes 3.45. Range bet is fine on this one. What about 854 flush draw? 3.5 becomes 3.4. It's going to be fine. 642, 3.56 becomes 3.48. It's going to be fine. 743 flush draw, 3.53 becomes 3.47. The 652 actually seems to be kind of an outlier so far. Now let's look at the most extremes, which of course is the boards the big blind likes to lead the most. 654. 763 looks like it has a lot of overbets. Wow, look at all these leads, leading nearly half the range when the hijack is using the one size strategy, because the one size is 1.33 times pot. So these boards are super rogue in terms of how they play out, because if the big blind doesn't have this leading range, when I force the big blind to check full range instead, the hijack now bets 29% of the time instead of 34.6% of the time. The less your opponent is leading, the more we actually want to check, because it doesn't change how good or bad the board is for us, but it does bolster their range because so many of the good hands that should be leading are still there. Look at this for some insight too. Your EV as the hijack wants the big blind checks when big blind has this betting range. So they're in the 56.2% portion of the range here when they check. The EV for the hijack is 3.77 compared to here when I force the big blind to check everything. So they've still got 100% of hands. Your EV's gone all the way down to 3.27. This is very, very significant difference. Just whether your opponent leads the flop or not. It is significant that we don't range bet all of these boards. 765 confirmed the strategy is significantly worse if we start doing the range bet. I think in reality, the best way to look at this is if it's a board the big blind can lead, that's your indication that range bet 25% doesn't work, rather than our checking range, because that is a big indication, but it's all tied together. We check a lot because the big blind leads a lot. I'm instead now going to filter, coming full circle, just the boards that the big blind checks the least. 654, 543, 765, the same boards but flush draws, and then 764, 754, paired 7, paired 8. I'm just going to draw some benchmarks. And so first with a 5% leading range, let's see how we do against that. Then I'm going to do 7% and see how we do against that. So 886, 3.65 EV, but let's force the big blind to check. 3.6 EV, forcing the range bet. 3.55 EV, 877, are you any different? 3.63, now 3.57, so this board's fine too. Let's look at 10%, 10.1%, 865. It seems more reasonable that people will actually lead boards like this, 3.3 and 3.18, which is getting towards that 5%. So I'm going to say that we throw all of these boards in the bin that are less than 10% leads for the big blind. We draw the line around here, 865 flush draw in this case, and we say range bet 25% on every single one of these boards, which is, almost every board that there is. Let's look at one more quick example first. Let's look at 753. Again, forcing the check, even though this might not happen in practice. 70% checks and overbets the rest of the time. 3.49 goes to 3.37, which again is like 3.5% EV loss. So it seems this is the trend line between we can bet 25% with range or we're going to lose more than 5% EV not to. Around about when your opponent can lead 10% of the time or more, it's your indication that this board is no longer good enough that we can get away with this. Next time, I'm going to pull up all of these boards and we're going to compose a strategy just for these exact boards and see, can we actually group these boards together? What if our opponent doesn't have a leading range? What if they have a good leading range? What does it make sense to do? Now, I'm just going to draw the line right here, at least 10% lead, so that's going to be 865 and above. And for what it's worth, this is less than 1% of all total boards. We do have this last little asterisk here, but there's still a lot of these boards that are fine. In reality, I think I should make the middling boards go to also 9 high and change this to less than 9 high boards. There are some paired boards still in here, like King 7-7 seems to be there. 7-7-6. It looks like paired 7 is quite meaningful. That is at least 99% of boards that in this dynamic you can get away with this strategy and not lose more than 3% EV compared to the perfect theory strategy. And they don't necessarily check raise enough as it is, let alone check raise more than they're supposed to, which would likely be the correct counter strategy, or to call more than they're supposed to. I will come back to overbetting and I will come back to constructing a checking back range on the flop. But for now, because this is most situations, we're going to move on to looking at the big blind response. How do we respond with check call? How do we respond with check raise? What sort of hands are good bluffs? What sort of hands are actually too good to fold on the flop, which maybe people are already over folding? So we can gain a lot of EV just by looking at this stuff. Then from there, we'll move on to turns. Then we'll move on to, from both sides, move on to rivers. And then when it comes to the more nitty gritty stuff, like this, we'll come back to it later. Hopefully knowing all of this put you in good stead to figure it out on the fly and to develop your intuition. Once we've got to the end of a conventional hand, like we've opened, we've bet, and then maybe we've checked, maybe we've barreled, the bet line, the bet check bet line, the bet check call river, etc. Everything that is more conventional. Then I'm either going to move on to the differences between the different positions, or we'll come back to this, which is checking the flop or using different flop bet sizes. So that's chapter 4, and I'll see you next week. Thanks for watching.